Hey there. Ready to dive into some Clausewitz with us? We're tackling Book 6, chapters 27 through 30 of On War today, focusing on defending a theater of war. We figured, since you're no stranger to military strategy, this deep dive would be right up your alley.
It's a dense read,
Oh, yeah.
but there's some seriously important stuff in here about how defending a theater of war is about more than just holding territory. Clausewitz reminds us that war, at its heart, is about achieving political goals.
Okay, let's unpack that. What does he mean by the political goals of war, and how does that relate to actually defending a piece of land?
Clausewitz argues that destroying the enemy's army often leads to you win the territory by default, but simply taking territory doesn't mean you've completely broken their army or achieved your political goals.
So it's like you can capture the hill, but if the enemy can still regroup and strike back, you haven't really won the battle, right?
Exactly. Clausewitz is a big proponent of concentrating your forces for a decisive blow whenever possible. But he also digs into those situations where a defender might deliberately split their forces and the strategy behind that choice.
Interesting. He uses this analogy of a center of gravity,
Yeah.
right? What's that all about?
It's a powerful concept. Think of it this way. In any military force, there's a point where the greatest concentration of strength lies. That's the center of gravity. It could be their best troops, a crucial supply line, or even something less tangible like popular support back home.
Okay, so if you can pinpoint and cripple that center of gravity, you significantly increase your chances of success. Makes sense.
Right. But here's where Clausewitz gets even more interesting. He warns against taking that idea of concentration too far. Sometimes you have to spread your forces to protect other vital areas or go after secondary objectives.
So it's a balancing act. You need enough force to be effective, but overextending yourself could leave you vulnerable elsewhere.
Absolutely. Whether it's 1815 or today, it's about strategic allocation of resources and realizing that every action has ripple effects across the theater of war.
He's big on using historical examples to prove his point, too. He talks about how a nation's size and unity can impact its ability to wage war, right? Like smaller unified states have an easier time concentrating their forces, while larger, more spread out ones or even alliances face a whole other set of challenges.
Right, again, and those challenges link directly back to how well a nation can defend its territory. Clausewitz puts a lot of emphasis on unity of command, especially for the defender.
So presenting a united front, both in terms of military might and political willpower, makes sense.
It's absolutely essential. He stresses clear communication, shared goals, and a solid strategy, especially for whoever's on the defensive. They need to present that united front to have any hope of repelling an attack.
So we've established that concentrating your forces for a decisive strike is generally the preferred tactic. But we've also touched on how sometimes a defender might have to spread their forces out. He talks specifically about defending a theater of war, which seems like a bigger concept than just defending a single location.
It is a much bigger concept. For Clausewitz, a theater of war isn't just a battlefield. It's the whole geographical area where military actions happen. It's about troop movements, battles, logistics, even the morale of the people within that space.
So defending a whole theater of war, it's less about holding every inch of land and more about achieving the victory that ultimately fulfills your political goals.
You've got it. And within that, Clausewitz identifies two key elements for defending a theater.
Yeah.
Decision and the state of expectation.
Well, let's break those down. Decision sounds fairly straightforward, like making the choice to engage the enemy.
It is, but with an added layer of complexity. It's more than just picking when to fight. It's about recognizing when a decisive moment has arrived, when the outcome in this particular theater will have a huge impact on the entire war effort.
So it's about more than just that one battle. It's about recognizing those larger turning points and making a move when it matters most.
Exactly. Now, the state of expectation that one has a psychological component. Clausewitz argues that the defender, just by already being in the theater, has an advantage in the state of expectation. They can use the terrain, their defenses, even just knowing the local conditions better to their benefit.
They're playing on their home turf, so to speak. They can use that familiarity to anticipate enemy movements and better prepare themselves.
Precisely. Because the attacker is the one who has to cross into the defender's territory, there's more pressure on them to make the first move. This gives the defender a chance to set the pace, even before the fighting begins.
So it's like setting a trap, in a way. You control the battlefield, and you wait for the enemy to make a mistake.
It's a good analogy. But Clausewitz is careful to point out that the state of expectation works best when both sides are actually spoiling for a decisive fight. If one side isn't fully committed to that outcome, the whole thing changes.
Which leads us to situations where neither side really wants that decisive battle. Clausewitz calls this successive resistance, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes, and he is not a fan. He sees this approach, where you're basically trying to wear down the enemy bit by bit, as going against the very nature of war.
So trying to delay the inevitable.
Exactly. Clausewitz argues that while drawing out the conflict might seem appealing initially, it rarely leads to the desired outcome. You might buy some time, but at what cost? You risk exhausting your resources, crushing morale, and still not achieving a true victory.
That makes sense. He believed that concentrating your forces, your military power, and your strategic focus was the only real path to a lasting victory.
Exactly. Constantly falling back and giving up ground, even strategically, can be detrimental to a defender's overall position. For Clausewitz, the real test of military genius is in recognizing those pivotal moments and having the guts to act decisively. He absolutely believed that, and that's what makes his take on those situations where a decisive outcome isn't the goal so fascinating. He calls these wars of observation, where the focus changes from total victory to strategic maneuvering and maintaining the status quo.
So instead of aiming for a knockout punch, it becomes more of a strategic chess match.
Exactly. It's a delicate dance, with each side looking for an advantage without overcommitting or risking too much. They might be trying to grab small bits of territory, secure resources, or maybe take a weakly defended objective, all without triggering a major confrontation.
And in that kind of scenario, the defender still has the upper hand, at least in terms of the state of expectation.
Absolutely. They can use their knowledge of the terrain, their defenses, their ability to react quickly to keep the attacker guessing. Think small-scale raids, disrupting supply lines, feints and distractions, all while trying to avoid a full-blown engagement.
So outmaneuvering and outsmarting your opponent rather than just throwing superior force at them.
That's the game. It's about leveraging every advantage you have, making the most of what you've got, especially if you're facing a larger enemy force. And Clausewitz doesn't dismiss this kind of maneuvering warfare, not at all. He recognizes that it requires a whole different kind of strategic thinking.
A commander needs a keen eye for opportunity, a real understanding of their opponent, and the ability to completely switch gears on the fly. That sounds incredibly challenging.
It is. It's a constant game of cat and mouse, where the advantage can swing back and forth in an instant. A seemingly insignificant decision can snowball into something much larger. This type of warfare really tests the commander. Can they think ahead, predict their opponent's moves, and then react quickly when things inevitably change?
So even when avoiding a huge battle, this war of observation can be just as demanding on a commander. Patience and cunning become crucial, alongside just brute force.
You could say that. But Clausewitz is careful to warn against getting too fixated on the tactical maneuvering. You can get so focused on winning the small battles that you lose sight of the bigger strategic picture, those political objectives we talked about earlier.
It's easy to get lost in the weeds. You can't lose sight of the forest for the trees or forget what you're fighting for in the first place, right?
Exactly. That's where a true understanding of Clausewitz's core idea that war is fundamentally a political act becomes so important. Even in a war of observation, if you forget that, you risk making decisions that hurt your nation's goals more than they help.
It's about walking a tightrope, being adaptable, and taking advantage of opportunities, but never losing track of that ultimate goal.
Absolutely. Clausewitz outlines some specific tactics for this kind of war, targeting an enemy's supply lines, for instance.
Makes sense. Disrupting logistics can really throw a wrench in their plans, even if you're not engaging them directly.
Right. Especially in a prolonged war of observation, logistics become absolutely essential.
Then there are things like diversions and incursions, essentially raids into enemy territory.
Exactly. They can be used to pull enemy troops away from more important areas, creating opportunities elsewhere. They can also be a much-needed morale boost for your own troops and for your people back home.
It's about reminding your opponent and your own side that you're still a force to be reckoned with, even if you're not engaging in huge, decisive battles.
Right. And then, of course, there's always the possibility of launching focused attacks on enemy units or positions, but only if the circumstances are absolutely right.
So picking your battles carefully, only engaging when you have a clear advantage and a specific objective in mind.
Absolutely. You can't afford to waste your strength on engagements that don't give you a real strategic gain. Every move has to count.
We've talked a lot about tactics and maneuver, But throughout all of this, you can see how much emphasis Clausewitz puts on choosing the right place to make your stand right, on positioning.
He does, especially in a war of observation, where avoiding a decisive battle is often the goal. The strength of your position can make or break you. You want to maximize any advantage you have.
So even if you're trying to avoid a major fight, choosing the right place to position your forces is still absolutely critical.
It's crucial, and one of the most interesting things Clausewitz points out is that sometimes the best way to defend a fortress isn't to hole up inside it, but to position your army in front of it.
Wait, really? That seems counterintuitive. Why wouldn't you use the fortress's defenses to your advantage?
It's about psychology. Remember, in this kind of war, the attacker is looking for low-risk, high-reward situations. A fortress can be a tempting target, especially if it seems weakly defended.
So if you put your army in front of the fortress, you're daring the enemy to attack, knowing they probably don't want to risk a major engagement.
That's the idea. Of course, it's a calculated risk. If they call your bluff, you could be in a tough spot. But if it works, you've protected a vital asset without a fight.
High stakes. But what happens if they decide to just bypass the fortress completely?
That's a risk you have to consider. But even in a war of observation, the attacker has limitations. They have to think about logistics, maintaining their supply lines, and their overall strategic goals.
They can't just wander around wherever they please. Their options are still limited by the realities of waging war.
Exactly. That's where the defender's knowledge of the terrain and their ability to anticipate enemy movements becomes a huge advantage. They can use that knowledge to predict where the enemy is most likely to go and position their forces accordingly.
So you're essentially forcing them into predictable patterns, even if you can't control everything they do.
Right. But there's another aspect to this that Clausewitz brings up. The psychological impact on the enemy when they know a fortress is nearby, even if they decide to avoid it.
That makes sense. Like a thorn in their side, a constant reminder that you're still a threat.
Yes, it can really wear down their morale, make them think twice about taking risks. They'll constantly be wondering if you're about to launch a surprise attack from that fortress they chose to ignore. It adds a whole other layer to the game.
It's a mind game as much as anything else. We've talked a lot about the defender's advantages in a war of observation, but the attacker must have some counters to these tactics, right?
Of course. It's never one-sided. One of the most effective ways for an attacker to counter a skilled defender in this situation is simple. Be unpredictable. Don't let them get comfortable, and never let them think they know what you're going to do next.
So avoid falling into predictable patterns. Do the unexpected.
Exactly. The attacker, who can mask their true intentions, feint in one direction and then strike in another, can really disrupt the defender's carefully prepared plans. It forces them to react instead of dictate.
Turning the state of expectation right back on them. I like it.
It's a powerful tool, and it highlights why intelligence gathering is so crucial in any conflict, but especially in this kind of war. Whoever has the most up-to-date and accurate information on their enemy has a huge advantage. Knowing your enemy's movements, their intentions, their capabilities, that's essential.
Knowledge is power, as they say. Now, we've been talking about fortresses, but what about defending a much larger, more open territory? That seems like a much tougher challenge, especially against a numerically superior enemy.
It definitely presents its own set of difficulties. In these situations, Clausewitz talks about using natural obstacles to your advantage, things like rivers, mountains, forests, swamps, anything that can slow the enemy down and force them into predictable paths.
Essentially using the terrain to funnel their movements, making them vulnerable, or at least buying yourself some time.
Exactly. But as we were discussing, defending a large open area against a bigger force is a daunting task. You can't be everywhere at once.
So how do you prioritize? How do you decide where to dig in and fight and where to cut your losses and cede ground?
That's where the real art of strategic decision-making comes in. You have to weigh the importance of the territory, the potential risks and rewards of engaging the enemy, and the overall goals of the war itself. Sometimes a tactical retreat is necessary. Sometimes you have to give up ground to preserve your forces and live to fight another day.
So it's about choosing your battles, making sure that when you do commit to a fight, it's from a position of strength at a time and place of your choosing.
You've got it. And that's where Clausewitz's ideas about the center of gravity come back into play. Even if you're defending a large area, you don't have to and often can't defend every single inch of it. You're looking for opportunities to hit the enemy where it hurts their center of gravity, to deliver a blow that shakes their resolve and makes them rethink their whole strategy.
So even when you're on the defensive, you're not just trying to hold on for dear life. You're looking for ways to shift the momentum, to seize control of the narrative, to make the enemy react to you instead of the other way around.
Precisely. That's what Clausewitz saw as the true mark of a brilliant commander. The ability to recognize those crucial moments and act decisively when the stakes are high.
It's incredible how much of his writing still resonates today. But as we've been discussing, Clausewitz doesn't just give us a framework for understanding war. He also offers some pretty stark warnings, right?
He does. One of the most important is his caution against getting so caught up in the tactical details, those smaller maneuvers and countermaneuvers, that you misjudge your opponent's willingness to escalate the conflict.
It's like that saying, you win the battle but lose the war. Getting so focused on the small victories that you lose sight of the bigger picture.
That's a great way to put it. Clausewitz reminds us that even actions that seem limited, even those meant to maintain the status quo, can quickly spiral out of control. And that's especially true in our modern world, where conflicts can involve so many different actors with overlapping interests and the constant potential for things to escalate rapidly.
That line between a war of observation and a full-blown conflict can get blurry really fast.
Absolutely. Which is why Clausewitz stresses the importance of never losing sight of your political objectives, yours and your opponents. It's about understanding that war is a tool, a means to achieve a political goal, not an end in itself.
So even in the midst of those tactical chess matches, you can't forget the larger strategic endgame. You have to constantly be thinking a few moves ahead.
Exactly, and that takes real strategic maturity, the ability to see beyond the immediate situation and understand how your actions might ripple out and impact the broader political landscape. It's about playing the long game.
It might mean making a tactical retreat, conceding a minor point to achieve a more significant strategic victory down the road. Tough decisions, but that's the reality of war.
Right. And this ties in with another important Clausewitzian concept we haven't really touched on yet, the culminating point of victory.
Okay, let's dig into that. What did Clausewitz mean by the culminating point of victory?
He argued that every military victory, even the most decisive one, carries within it the seeds of its own decline. There comes a point where the attacker's momentum starts to falter, their resources get stretched thin, their supply lines overextended.
So it's like even when you're winning, you're not necessarily getting stronger. At some point, the tide starts to turn.
Exactly. Each victory comes at a cost. Eventually, those costs, those sacrifices, they begin to outweigh the benefits. And the defender, even though they might be losing ground, might actually be getting stronger, shortening their lines, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage.
Interesting. It's like that saying, the bigger they are, the harder they fall.
Right. A seemingly insurmountable force can become vulnerable if they overextend themselves, if they push too far too fast. And that's why Clausewitz urged commanders to always be thinking about the long game.
It's about knowing when to stop, how to consolidate your gains, and how to shift from a defensive to an offensive strategy when the opportunity presents itself. About recognizing that culminating point and adapting your strategy accordingly.
You've got it. And that brings us back to adaptability and flexibility. A commander who can recognize that point, who can shift gears and exploit the changing situation, will always have the upper hand.
It's about recognizing that the situation is fluid, always in motion. Clausewitz definitely understood that warfare is about so much more than just brute force and military might.
Yeah, he absolutely did. He understood the psychological and intellectual dimensions of war, the importance of morale, the need for clear communication, and the dangers of underestimating your opponent.
He saw that war is a fundamentally human endeavor, with all of the complexities and contradictions that implies.
And that even in the midst of such chaos, such violence, there's a certain beauty to the strategic thinking, the intellectual struggle that underpins it all.
That's a great way to put it. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Clausewitz, what are some of the most important things that military leaders today can learn from his work? What can they take away from his writing to help them navigate the incredibly complex challenges of 21st century warfare?
That's a big question, but I think one of the most important takeaways is the idea that war is never simple, never straightforward. It's a complex interplay of factors, political, social, military, psychological, and understanding those connections is absolutely crucial for success.
So don't get so focused on the trees that you miss the forest. You have to be able to see the bigger picture, understand the strategy, and never lose sight of the underlying political objectives that are driving the conflict.
Absolutely. And perhaps even more importantly, Clausewitz teaches us that adaptability and flexibility are paramount. The battlefield is constantly changing. A good commander needs to be able to think on their feet, adjust to new information, and be prepared to completely throw out the plan if the situation demands it.
Be decisive, but not rigid. Trust your instincts, but be willing to adapt.
Exactly. And finally, I think it's important to remember that even in an age of incredibly advanced technology, warfare is still, at its heart, a human endeavor.
It's fought by people, led by people, and its costs are felt most deeply by people.
That's right. Understanding the human cost of war, the motivations and fears of everyone involved, that's essential for making sound strategic decisions.
And that's something that no amount of technological advancement can ever change.
You're absolutely right. Clausewitz's work reminds us that true strategic brilliance lies not just in mastering the tools of warfare, but in understanding the people who wield them and the people who are impacted by them.
So, as we've learned from our deep dive today, war is never truly won or lost on the battlefield alone. It's the political, social, and psychological landscapes that truly determine the outcome of any conflict.
That's an excellent summation. Clausewitz's work is just as relevant now as it was in his time. It challenges us to think critically, to engage deeply with the complexities of warfare, and never to underestimate the human element in any conflict.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into On War. We encourage everyone listening to explore these ideas further, see how they apply to your own experiences, and never stop learning from history's lessons. Until next time.
Until next time.